conversation started. Russ?
Thank you, Wes. Hello, and welcome to the next installment of the ASIL series on international law and the 2020 presidential election. What's at stake? My name is Russ Lamott. I lead the international environmental practice at Beveridge and Diamond, a law firm here in Washington, and I'm going to be your moderator today. Our topic is climate change. And here's our game plan for this session. I'm going to briefly set the stage and then introduce our panelists today. And then we're going to jump into a discussion. But this session is being live streamed. So we do hope to allow for a Q&A session with those who are participating in the audience on the live stream at the end of that discussion. If you have a question, there is a Q&A box on the screen through the Zoom chat. Please drop your question into that box and we will take them up, time permitting, at the end of the discussion. I'll put them to the panelists. All right, I'm going to start with a super brief scene setter and then introduce the panelists. We are 40 days from the election, and indeed early voting has started in a number of states. Both of the candidates were in California last week talking about climate change. The media attention and maybe the electorate's attention has shifted, understandably, in the last few days with the recent passing of Justice Ginsburg. But the challenge of climate change continues to unfold in the background of this election. So I could think of no better way to set the stage or provide context for this discussion than just to pull from the headlines in a single newspaper one day last week. From the headlines. So unprecedented forest megafires on the West Coast. That's what brought both candidates out there last week. Smoke affecting air quality, even here in Washington, 2,500 miles away. A story about sharply rising temperatures in the Arctic and rapidly diminished sea ice, leading to the evolution of an entirely new ecosystem there. Huge Antarctic glaciers starting to separate from the continental landmass even earlier than expected. Multiple active hurricanes in the Atlantic. One recent point, there were 5 separate hurricanes being tracked. We still have a week to go in September as we record this session, and the National Hurricane Center has had to shift into the Greek alphabet for naming purposes. And last week there was a op-ed piece in the New York Times prompting serious discussions about the prospects of millions of climate migrants just here in the United States in the coming decades, not to speak of the national security issues raised by instability from climate migration on a global scale. It's also Climate Change Week in New York City, connected to the UN General Assembly session. So I think we can check the relevance box for our discussion today. Our goal is to examine this really dauntingly broad topic through the relatively narrow lens of US presidential politics. The power and influence of the US president is often the subject of some hyperbole, I think, but it does not feel hyperbolic to say that in this area, at least, the US president, the policies of the president, personnel of the president will have an outsized impact, particularly in the coming years. IPCC models that would limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would require rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy, land use, infrastructure, industrial systems. All of those models that get there, that keep us there at that 1.5 degree target, require a dramatic bending of the net emissions curve starting now and for the next few years. Those models say, in essence, we need to reach zero emissions, net emissions by 2050. Very steep downward curve from current levels, entailing a transformation on a scale not seen in human history. So against that cheerful backdrop, let's turn to the discussion at hand. I'm going to start by introducing the panelists in alphabetical order. Dave Banks is a chief strategist for the Republican side of the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. He was previously President Trump's special assistant for international energy and environment. at the National Security Council. He's also worked as Republican Deputy Staff Director at the Senate EPW Committee and as a senior advisor on international affairs and climate change for President George W. Bush. Dan Bodansky is a Regents Professor at Arizona State University. He was climate change coordinator at the U.S. State Department from 1999 to 2001, and he was a client of mine at the time when I was at the State Department. His latest book, which he co-authored, is called International Climate Change Law, published by Oxford University Press in 2017. Dan literally wrote the book on this subject today, and he's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Allison Starman is the General Counsel and Corporate Secretary of the American Chemistry Council. ACC represents the leading companies engaged in the business of chemistry. Allison leads legal strategy and manages board operations at ACC. Prior to joining ACC, she served as Deputy General Counsel at EPA and in other positions at EPA, and worked in private practice at a national law firm. So thank you all to the panelists for being here and contributing your time. Let's get right into the discussion. I am going to start off with you, Dan Bodansky, Professor Bodansky, hopefully helping us with a level set so that we're all on the same page to start the discussion out. Can you give us an overview of the Paris Agreement, which is the central, it's not the only, but the central global instrument addressing climate mitigation? What's its objective? How does it achieve that objective or not achieve that objective? What's the current status of the Paris Agreement? And then what's the United States' current status in the Paris Agreement? Can the US rejoin if it leaves the Paris Agreement, and if so, how? So that's a multi-part question, I think, but I know you're up to the task, Dan.
Great. Well, thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be here. Good to see you again, Russ. So Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. It was entered into force the following year. And I think the easiest way to describe it is in terms of three goals that it sets and then three mechanisms to achieve those goals. So the three goals, one relates to temperature, to keep global temperatures well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts to keep temperature increase below 1.5 degrees. There's an associated emissions goal, most importantly to reach net zero emissions in the second half of the century. And you can already see some countries starting to pledge to do that. Most recently, China with their 2060 announcement a couple of days ago. Second goal, resilience goal, to increase ability to adapt and be resilient to climate change. And the third goal is a finance goal to make financial flows consistent with the other two goals that I just mentioned. So those three goals and three mechanisms to try to get to those goals. So most importantly, probably nationally determined contributions. So each country is supposed to come forward with a plan for what they're going to be doing to reduce emissions. Secondly, a global assessment every 5 years to see how the world as a whole is doing in achieving the Paris Agreement's goals. And then countries come back with successive NDCs that are supposed to take into account the global stocktake every 5 years. And then finally, a transparency system consisting of various review mechanisms to try to make sure, assess whether countries are implementing and achieving their NDCs. Now, Paris allows parties to withdraw, giving 1 year's notice. So President Trump submitted the notice of withdrawal for the US November 4th, 2019. That's going to take effect a year later, November 4th, 2020 this year, the day after the election. President Biden could rejoin if he's elected president on day one, as I'm going to suggest later. The process by which President Obama joined the Paris Agreement initially was as an executive agreement. And I think on the same basis that President Obama joined the Paris Agreement, a new Biden presidency could rejoin the Paris Agreement. It would just require basically two things to do, not maybe so simple. One is to submit the instrument of acceptance, but the second is to submit a nationally determined contribution associated with the US rejoining the Paris Agreement.
Thanks, Dan. Just one quick follow-up question. So the current trajectory that we as the United States are on vis-a-vis the Paris Agreement is a withdrawal which would take effect in November. Is that correct?
So currently, we're still a party to the Paris Agreement for another month or so. But then the notice of withdrawal that was made almost 11 months ago is going to take effect November 4th of this year. So a little more than a month. And then we'll be out.
Okay, so let's pull that thread a little bit, the then we'll be out thread, and let's turn to the current administration's climate policies and a discussion about what that might look like in the event of a re-election of President Trump. So I'm going to call on Dave Banks for a discussion here. So in 2016, Dave, President Trump actively campaigned on canceling the Paris Agreement. And as Dan just laid out, the U.S. has in fact taken steps to withdraw from the agreement as soon as it could under the agreement. But he also indicated, at least back in 2017, at the time that he announced that he would pursue that withdrawal, a willingness to entertain a reentry into those negotiations, potentially for a revised global agreement, at least in principle. In the meantime, at the domestic level, the Trump administration's policies have focused on a climate change deregulatory agenda that focuses instead on energy security. His affirmative environmental agenda has focused on non-climate issues like Superfund and coastal protection, chemicals issues. In the meantime, though, we have seen, as we talked about at the beginning, a very dramatic manifestation of climate change impacts here in the United States just over the last couple months, in fact, and even some movement among the broader public around concerns about climate change, including voters in both parties. So, multi-part question for you, Dave, with that in mind. Any recent clues as part of whether as part of the current campaign rhetoric or things that you're hearing otherwise about how a second-term Trump administration would engage, disengage, take a different approach on climate change challenges in light of the status or the trajectory that we're currently on with respect to Paris? And more broadly, is there any indication that those policies that we've seen over the last few years might shift once a re-election has been secured?
Sorry about that. Good question, but look, I think the top line is not really, at least not in the first few years of a second term. I mean, look, the president's a climate skeptic, but that's really well known. I mean, just last week or whatever, right? He certainly expressed his skepticism of the science. But you know what? I think the difference here from if you compare the president and maybe some other sort of conservative politicians is that the president is not an ideologue on climate change. So unlike a number of conservatives, for example, he does not oppose climate action simply because it's about climate or CO2 emissions. He views climate policy through the lens of competitiveness, what it does to the economy, to our manufacturing base. Is it fair, unfair? Why does China get by with increasing its emissions when we're expected to reduce them? So this view has its roots in the Kyoto Protocol debate. So so those talking points are essentially from that period. But folks, I think it's important to note that folks on both sides of the aisle here in DC are typically bogged down in kind of a 1990s discussion on climate change as how it pertains to actual policy and measures that people are tabling. But I do think that there is a potential shift, but it would depend on staffing, no question about that. There's a potential shift if the administration could somehow merge climate and trade policy in a way that advances the president's manufacturing and trade agenda. Most people don't understand that the United States is on a decarbonization trend. We might get in a discussion of, is it happening fast enough? But it's certainly on a decarbonization trend. Moreover, compared to China, we're far less carbon intensive in a number of US sectors. So simply put, the United States could theoretically use a climate and trade policy that would make our products more competitive, given their lower GHG life cycle profile. So in that sense, there's an alignment of interest in Europe, North America, and a good chunk of the OECD. In general, Western companies are cleaner producers from a GHG perspective than government-owned enterprises. In my opinion, I think the president, again, depending on the staff, would be really interested in that concept. But again, that policy shift will require different staff across the administration and within the executive office. You've got to have someone that would run a policy process that would deliver some type of proposal to the president for consideration. And this whole sort of climate and trade piece, which again, I think, could work for the administration, that's going to have to come from outside the box. And that's not going to, I don't see that happening quickly, even if it does. But, there's a chance that something like that could be possible in year 7 and 8 of a second term, or of, the first and second term combined, especially given the fact that you've got this ongoing discussion in Europe on border carbon adjustments that will have a certain effect and will create a new dynamic in conversations around climate and trade policy. I think that U.S. policymakers will become more and more in touch or aware of that type of policy thinking and could do something with it. But let me say this one really fast thing. I do think that that even if none of that happens in a second term, you would still see key components of climate policy advance at the agency level. So I know that EPA gets most of the headlines because of its domestic regulatory authority, but EPA's ability to actually address global climate change is really limited, right? I think you would see DOE continue to promote the clean technology programs, which, in my opinion, is more important to addressing global emissions. And I would imagine that an agency like the Department of Agriculture would continue to work on natural solutions and that part of the agenda, which is also a crucial component of climate mitigation.
Thanks, Dave. And there are a couple of things that I think we're going to want to come back to that you identified in your initial remarks. I have one follow-up question. Then, Dan or Allison, please feel free to also jump in. You mentioned that a lot is going to be determined by the policy, by the personnel. Personnel is policy here in Washington, as we often say, and we don't know what that's going to look like. We do, I think, based on experience with first to second term administrations, we can anticipate a very significant amount of turnover that typically happens in between terms of a reelected president. So based on that, we should anticipate some turnover in senior personnel, but we don't know what it's going to look like. And if the incoming staff bears the same ideological position as the incumbent staff and senior people, one question is, where is the impotence for that sort of the linkage of climate change and trade policy that you mentioned going to come from? And I wondered if you might be willing to share just a couple thoughts, given your current position over on the Hill, about whether there might be pressure or ideas generated by Republicans on the Hill that might at least be a driver for consideration of that kind of linkage, particularly if we continue to see more and more public interest or more and more public concern about climate change as a threat or even an emergency.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, because you have seen a shift amongst Republicans on the Hill. over the past few years. You've got, a decent amount of activity on the Senate side, but also in the House with the Select Committee. Before the pandemic hit, Leader McCarthy was moving forward with a climate package, which is notably important because it was the first time Republican House leadership took that type of initiative. That's all been kind of put on hold because of the pandemic and the other things that are happening, obviously. But I would expect that trend to continue up on the Hill. So yeah, I do think that there is potential for some ideas to come from Republicans on the Hill that could influence a second term. And I would probably say that at least in the first few years of a second term, that would probably be more likely to have an effect than, say, the effect of staff turnover. I mean, if you look at the key agencies here, they got new leadership, or the current leadership hasn't been there that long. So I would expect them to stay at least for another few years. But then also, even within the executive office of the president, you don't have some of the I think some of the staff positions. Keep in mind, they eliminated the International Economic Shop within the NSC and kind of merged that portfolio in the NEC. You need people to be able to do this work, and you need people who've got enough time to sort of run that type of process. I don't think I've got my doubts about whether they could actually pull that off. But on the trade side, you'd have to have NEC, the National Economic Council, the National Security Council, and the trade rep, State Department, Commerce. They would all have to be part of that process and discussing it. And right now, I do think that when we're talking about climate trade policy, there's not a lot of empirical evidence, right, as far as what kind of consequences, impacts it has. We still don't know who are the winners and losers in this type of trade regime. When I say losers, within the United States, domestic industries. So I think a lot of work would have to be done on that front.
Okay, well, I think this last comment about U.S. industry is a good segue to a question that I might put to Allison, unless anybody wants to jump in on what Dave has just laid out. Dan, do I see you?
Well, I just wanted to come back and maybe quickly. I guess I'd like to hope that Dave is right, that all is not lost if President Trump gets reelected. But I guess I'm less optimistic. I mean, obviously, things can still go ahead, state and local level, and by industry. So there certainly can be areas where there's progress made. But it's not just that we're not making progress at the federal level. We're actually going backwards in a lot of respects, in respect to, for example, methane, the ability of state governments to regulate, like California, automobile standards. So moving backwards, and I guess I think the election is probably the single most important thing for the climate this year by far, because it not only means that if President Trump gets reelected, there is unlikely to be a lot of kind of dramatic things that need to be done at the federal level. It also will be a body blow, I think, for the multilateral process if the U.S. Not only was withdrawn from Paris, but is going to stay out for at least another 4 years. It makes that process much more difficult. It is a global problem, so it requires multilateral action, and this administration has not shown a great interest in multilateralism. U.S. standing, I think, is very low internationally, so the world is desperate for U.S. leadership on this issue. But this administration is in a very poor position to try to do the kinds of things which might be very interesting that Dave mentioned about linking trade and climate, but that requires getting a lot of buy-in from other countries, which I think this administration will be poorly positioned to do. So I think for a number of reasons, I view the election as really, to some degree, crucially important, hopefully not make or break, but crucially important if we're going to be able to successfully address the climate problem.
Yeah, I will just to pull on one point that Dan made about Dave's predictions for the future in his crystal ball. It was notable to me also, Dave, that even in your most optimistic scenario, there was no mention of a re-engagement in the multilateral processes. So to the extent that there is a climate agenda that makes its way into a second administration, it sounds to me like that what we're looking at is, bilateral trade linkage at the international level as the most optimistic scenario, and a perhaps further maybe complete withdrawal from the multilateral process. But we can come back to some of those. I mean, Dave, I'll let you weigh in on that. But one of the things, this Paris is not the only thing on the multilateral stage, and so there may be other areas where a second Trump administration does continue to or re-engages further outside of Paris. But I didn't hear that as a central plank of Dave's most optimistic scenario. Dave, is that right?
Yeah, look, I'm not incredibly optimistic. So I would agree with Dan on that. But it is largely staff driven. So you could have a scenario. Russ, going back to your point, that the president in that Rose Garden speech actually left the door open for Paris reentry. But that would have required, the right staff, within the EOP and within the agencies. They're not there, right? But I do think that it is possible. May not be very optimistic about it, but it is possible that you could have some staff turnover in key places. That could cause a shift in the policy.
Okay. Well, let's shift back to one of those areas where, Dave, you mentioned, and I think Dan, you acknowledged that there is ongoing work in the background outside of the regulatory context, and that's in the private environmental governance and industry-driven initiatives. So I'm going to ask you, Allison, ACC's members operate in a highly regulated industry where those regulatory requirements involve significant capital investments for compliance purposes. Some of your largest members have adopted their own climate change commitments, tightened those recently, and even tied them to the Paris Agreement's objectives. And ACC itself has adopted sustainability commitments recently. Can you say a little bit about, from your perspective, what the business community, to the extent you can speak for that community or just the chemical sector, is focused on with respect to climate challenges, and also what you think that your sector or the business community at large is hoping to see in future climate change policy from the United States, and maybe also hoping to avoid in that policy?
Sure, Russ. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. And as you rightly pointed out, many of our members have already adopted climate change commitments. In addition to the individual company commitments, as you mentioned, ACC has adopted climate policy principles and sustainability commitments. Our climate policy principles are pretty similar. Our principles are, first of all, consistent with the goals of the Paris Agreement. We think that they should put an economy-wide price on carbon. They should address carbon leakage protection, which is something that Dave referred to a little bit earlier. They should credit avoided emissions, such as the many products that our industry creates or that are enabled by our industry that help address greenhouse gas emissions in the use phase. And then they should also exempt fossil energy when it is used as a feedstock. Since in our industry, fossil materials are frequently used as raw materials and that do not result in a release of greenhouse gases in their production. So those are our climate policy principles. You also mentioned sustainability, and ACC's membership has made several sustainability commitments. Included in those is a commitment to achieving measurable reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and pollutants in the manufacture and distribution of our products. But you asked what industry, particularly the chemical industry, would be looking for. And part of the backbone of our climate policy and our sustainability commitment is innovation. Our industry can and already is providing solutions to the climate problem. Whether it is enabling the use of CO2 as a feedstock, such as in the production of polyols and air gases, or identifying more efficient catalysts, or other areas such as products that enable solar panels, wind turbines, energy storage solutions, the business of chemistry is a solution provider. And so making sure that policy decisions support innovation and are not proscriptive in identifying a particular technology based on what exists today. So those are the principles that are guiding the chemical industry and ACC's membership as we look towards supporting a broad-based global climate policy.
Okay, thank you, Allison. I think what I'm hearing is at least in part resonating with Dave's comment about what he does anticipate under a second Trump administration, which would be a continuation of support for various clean technology programs focusing on innovation as a potential tool in the tool set to address climate change issues. And it sounds like the chemical industry sees itself as a solution provider in that space as well. So enabling policies that promote those kinds of innovations would be part of your goals. And it sounds like part of what we would expect under a Trump administration. I think one of the things that we can maybe turn to next is what we might see shifting gears in the second half of our discussion to what we might look for or expect to see in a Biden administration, a shift in administrations, and maybe we can come back, Allison, to your goals and see whether those align with what we might expect from a Biden administration. So I'm going to ask Dan, who did serve as a climate change advisor to a prior Democratic administration, to put that hat back on and imagine that he's asked to lead the transition team climate team in the event of a Biden victory in November. What are the top things, Dan, that you would put on your list of recommendations for President Biden on day one, on January 20th, and maybe also in the first 100 days after taking office, and taking into account there is a constituency in the Democratic Party, obviously, for which this issue is front and center, but that's not the only constituency that would presumably help propel Biden to victory if he does win. What would not be on that list, maybe taking into account some of the things that Allison just said? What kinds of policy choices would not be on that list for the first day or the first 100 days? And I'll let you tick through. I imagine there's going to be a number of things on that list, including maybe let's start maybe with the Paris Agreement and what that looks like, but I know it won't be limited to Paris. So over to you, Dan.
Great, thanks. So first of all, I should say I am not working on the Biden campaign. I don't speak for the Biden campaign or transition. So all of this is just my personal reflections. There is a very detailed Biden climate plan that's on their website that has a substantial international component. So some of the things I'm going to be mentioning are things that are in the Biden plan already. So I think just first of all, just a couple things maybe to orient what I'm going to say. So after 4 years of, in my view, not just inaction, but retrogression in a lot of ways, there's a lot to do. Some of it is, I think, undoing things that the Trump administration did, but we need to do a lot more. The situation now is quite different from 2016. So it's not just a matter of rolling back the clock, restoring the status quo ante. It requires a lot more action. Some of what I'm going to mention, things that need to be done, I think, are within the Paris Agreement. Specifically, as you mentioned, some are outside, sort of part of what Sue Biniaz, who's worked on the climate issue for many years, calls the broader Paris metropolitan community. And then I think a lot of it's going to depend on how much he can do, how much he can achieve on the election results more generally. So in particular, whether the Democrats control both houses of Congress, because if they don't, then a lot of it's going to be constrained to what President Biden might be able to do through executive action alone. So let me just mention sort of a very quick top 10 list just to get some ideas out of the table. So first of all, rejoin Paris. That's something he can do on day one. Secondly, recommit to the Green Climate Fund. That's another thing he can do on day one, although getting the actual money to contribute will require congressional action. So those are largely just undoing things that President Trump did. Third, I think, though, very importantly, push for increased international ambition. But that's going to require credibility, and that's going to require being able to show that there's things happening domestically in the US, either by industry, by state and local governments, but I think importantly by the federal government. So it's going to be a delicate balance in pushing for higher ambition between being ambitious, but also being credible. And that's a very fine line to walk. I think one thing that's in the Biden plan is to call for a climate change summit at the heads of state level to try to ramp up ambition. And that's something that could be done in the first 100 days, but that's going to require getting the US House in order to be credible to push internationally. Fourth, I think try to operationalize Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, which is the finance goal. That's to make financial flows consistent with the Paris temperature and resilience goals. So that's not just a matter of providing green finance for things like renewables. It's also a matter of reducing brown finance for high intensive emitting sources. So that's things like financial disclosure of climate related risks, things like that. Because I think it's just as important, or perhaps maybe even more important, to be trying to reduce brown financial flows that are encouraging emitting industries as it is to be promoting green flows. Fifth, ratify the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which calls for the phase down of hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. These are very high greenhouse gas potential substances, so they have a very strong effect on global warming. The phase down under Kigali would, I think, lead to overall global temperature reductions of about 0.5 degree by the end of the century. So ratify Kigali to bring the US into that agreement. Six, support stronger measures under the International Maritime Organization to address emissions from shipping. In 2018, the International Maritime Organization adopted global goals for shipping, but they're now working on trying to put those goals into effect through operational and design measures. So US needs to get behind that effort and play a leadership role in designing operational and design measures for ships that can achieve the global goal for shipping. Seventh, push for a phase out of fossil fuel subsidies in G20 and WTO. So that's something that does have support, but it's going to require a lot of leadership and push to actually make that happen. Eighth, I think, focus on trying to save the Arctic. Arctic is one of the most highly impacted regions by climate change. Twice the rate of global warming in the Arctic is in lower latitudes. That's going to, I think, focus on methane, short-lived climate forcers. President Trump rolled back regulations on methane, so try to regulate methane, cut emissions of short-lived climate forcers like black carbon. That's super important. Ninth, I think, reinvigorate mission innovation. So this was to try to bolster R&D on clean emitting technologies. I think the Biden climate plan calls for a $400 billion investment in R&D and technology development. And then most of those 9, I think, are largely reflected in the Biden plan. The 10th is not one that's in the Biden plan, but it's something I think is very important. And that's to be looking at additional means of trying to deal with the climate crisis, because I'm not sure emission reductions are going to happen fast enough to be able to prevent severe harm. So there are a variety of what are called climate interventions or climate engineering, things like trying to reflect sunlight to lower temperature. These are highly controversial. They raise a lot of risk questions, safety questions, but I think it's we need to be looking at all options, and there's not enough research being done on that area. So I think trying to focus in particular, use some of the capital he's going to have coming in to try to focus some more research in the area of climate interventions. So that's sort of my top 10 list for things that I think he should be trying to focus on in his first year. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Quite a number of things that we can talk about there, and actually a couple of them that we will talk about. So I'm going to invite first Dave and Allison. Just if Dan called you during the period between the election and January 20th and said, "Hey, here's what's on our. I'm working for the transition team. Here's our draft plan. What do you guys think? I want some feedback from the industry community. I want some feedback from Republicans on the Hill." Is there anything in there that gives you particular heartburn, or what would your candid feedback, private feedback to Dan be in response to that question? We won't tell anybody. Start with you, Allison.
I think what I would first focus on is some of what I didn't hear, which was that we would want the Biden administration to recognize that climate policy really must recognize that the US has an interest in energy security and protecting the competitiveness of US manufacturing. And there are energy intensive, trade exposed industries that actually help reduce overall GHG emissions that are competing in a global economy. But the US chemical industry is state of the art and incredibly energy efficient. So US manufactured chemical products, for example, often enabled by natural gas here in the US, can have the ability to draw market share from abroad and frequently displace more GHG intensive production. So we would want to make sure that a Biden administration policies recognized that carbon reality, that displacing US manufacturing would not benefit greenhouse gas emissions worldwide.
Okay, I'm going to come back to that point in a moment when we talk about the border tax adjustment that's been proposed by the EU. But Dave, reactions to Dan's list, anything giving you heartburn, or things like Allison pointed out that would be missing from your standpoint?
Well, I certainly agree with Allison that that U.S. competitiveness definitely should be considered. That we can't bury our heads in the sand when it comes to this is a global problem. We need to agree on a set of facts as it pertains to not only where emissions are coming from, but the technology pathways that we need to pursue in order to drive down those emissions globally and not just domestically, right? Look, I mean, at least with Republicans, we talked a little bit about this, but there's definitely been a shift on how they talk about climate change. While the policies haven't changed, I would argue not really, there's a greater willingness to engage on the issue. Within the GOP, there's certainly support for the technology programs and innovation. There might be a difference in opinion as to how much we're spending, but there is strong support for maintaining U.S. competitiveness in key technologies, particularly as it pertains to sort of strategic competition with China. There's also a lot of support for bolstering supply chain security. And I think that's probably one of the biggest concerns today within the GOP on electric vehicles and the increased build out for renewables. So I think that if we could actually have a conversation about sort of pairing a lower carbon strategy in across energy policy with supply chain security, and bringing that supply chain more here. Maybe there's a carve out for treaty allies, but if a Biden administration recognized that you needed to sort of address these major concerns, I do think that would open up real opportunities for real engagement. And then there's the fossil fuel technology piece. More and more Democrats, their answer to fossil fuels is just keep them in the ground. But that doesn't make sense in a lot of ways. From a climate perspective, we should be focused on the advancement of those technologies that address the emissions from fossil fuel use, keeping in mind that the world's going to be using a lot of fossil fuels for the foreseeable future. And then, figuring out how to deploy those technologies globally at a massive scale. And to achieve that, the technologies have to be competitive. There's got to be a market for them because developing economies just won't buy them, right? And so we need to create a policy that creates incentives for companies here and abroad to deploy them This goes back to, potentially a role for trade and climate policy. But again, on the energy security side, it's irrational to pursue a domestic climate policy that would simply put more of the global energy supply in the hands of governments that are hostile to the United States, like Russia or Iran. There's no way those countries would ever adopt a keep it in the ground policy. I may have the number wrong, but 85% or so of the global oil supply is in the hands of state-owned enterprises. And I'm willing to bet that the vast majority of Americans, if they understood, some of these policy proposals that the Democrats are tabling, they look at it and go, "This is absolutely nuts." There's no reason for us to give those nations more control. So I would ask the transition team, yes, let's talk about building a national consensus on climate, but let's all acknowledge a basic set of facts that should inform that policy, and maybe a real conversation about the science and getting Republicans more comfortable in talking about climate as being a major challenge that we all have to address.
Okay, thank you, Dave. So I think we have to give Dan, in his fake capacity as a member of the Biden transition team, a chance to respond to anything. Do you see, are there points of engagement or opportunity there, Dan, in either what Allison shared or what Dave just said, where there might be opportunities, possibly not on all of those points, but on some of them where there could be a chance for advancement, particularly if, as you say, the Biden administration is under pressure. Obviously, I want to underline a point that you made at the beginning. A lot will depend on what happens in the congressional elections to determine how much leeway the Biden administration has, or support they have on the Hill. But leaving that aside, is there room for recognizing that it will be important for the Biden administration to achieve some of the objectives that you identified in your top 10, to have some early wins on the domestic front? Are there opportunities for engagement or collaboration on some of these points?
Well, thanks. So I actually didn't hear so much disagreement with specific things I said, because most of them wouldn't affect competitiveness of U.S. industry, things like mission innovation, research on climate engineering, IMO standards for shipping. Those are going to be global, so that's not going to be differential impact on the U.S. It's going to be standards that apply worldwide. Kigali Amendment, trying to do carbon risk or climate risk financial disclosure. So I think all of the concerns about competitiveness, whether we leave fossil fuels in the ground or use them, all go to really the third, which is pushing for more ambitious international action, which will have as a component necessarily stronger U.S. action. And so the question then is how the U.S. Has stronger action, what it does additionally to try to reduce U.S. emissions. And so that can be done in a variety of ways. That's going to be largely a matter of domestic policy. So I'm going to do a cop-out a little bit, because my focus wasn't on how the U.S. would do that. There are a lot of different ways one can do it. It could also be associated with some kind of border tax adjustment to try to protect trade-exposed industries. So those are all, I think, very important. They're details, very important details, obviously, as to how the U.S. would actually come up with a strong domestic plan, which I think is essential for the U.S. to have credibility to push internationally. But I am going to punt on the question of exactly what the U.S. domestic policy should be, because first of all, it's not, I think the focus here is international. And secondly, it's not something that I'm sufficiently expert on to really comment on. But I think there are ways of trying to address concerns about competitiveness implications if we have both by pushing for stronger international actions, so our actions are reciprocated by others, but also by things like trade measures to try to protect exposed industries, or providing subsidies for industries to protect them against the competitiveness implications.
Okay, fair enough. I want to make sure that we come back to, we've heard a couple times so far in the discussion about a border tax adjustment. So I want to just make sure that we are able to spend a moment on that, because it could likely play a role in shaping the debate outside the United States in the way that the U.S. interacts with the global climate community, completely separate from the multilateral framework and also outside the control of a Biden or a Trump administration. So let's talk a little bit about what that might look like. The new European Commission, which was sworn in at the beginning of the year, earlier this year announced in their European Green Deal, announced a potential consideration of a carbon border adjustment mechanism in the EU. That is a tax that would be imposed on imported commodities into the EU or finished products, articles imported into the EU that would vary depending on the level of carbon emissions that are attributable to that product, embedded carbon in a given product or commodity. Producers in countries that have carbon pricing measures, climate policies that are compatible or aligned with the EU would be exempt from that tax. This proposal is pretty popular in the EU, both with the public and, not surprisingly, with EU manufacturers who see it as a chance to level the playing field. And to Allison's point, so Allison, you guys make the chemicals that are found in products that are sold around the world. If the EU, this topic of a border tax adjustment has been on the back burner for the last 15 years, maybe longer. It's not a new idea, but it has attracted new prominence, perhaps in response to the possibility of a Trump administration re-election. It presents, I think, the potential for disruption to a global trading system that's already under some stress. Chemicals are highly traded. They also have a high relative carbon intensity. The same is true for other key products of the U.S. manufacturing sector, the trade on global markets. Let's talk a little bit about the border tax adjustment. Starting with you, Allison, how significant is this issue to the chemical sector? And do you see it as a risk that will affect the rules of trade in a way that could hurt the chemical sector?
Russ, you're exactly right. It is an important issue for our industry. Chemical manufacturing is a global industry. Our manufacturing, particularly for commodity chemicals, depends on an efficient global trade. So where there are unilateral climate policies, those must be matched with some sort of effective carbon leakage protection that would maintain a level playing field globally. That said, governments should also avoid policies that create those unwarranted trade and investment distortions. And we would like to see the governments avoid excess government interference in a global marketplace. But exactly what is going to be an excess government interference is still going to be where the devils are in the details about border adjustment mechanisms, as the different governments and including bodies like the EU put some additional flesh on the bones of their proposal.
Okay, and I have personally have not seen whether there are details on the whether we have seen flesh on the bones of the EU proposal. It's just been floated so far as I'm aware. But Dan, let me ask you, do you see this as a real threat? Is it just a trial balloon that has been floated by the EU again, or is something different this time around where this could well be imposed? And does it present obstacles or challenges? Are there challenges available to the United States under international law if there were a border tax adjustment imposed? How does that fit within the rest of the multilateral system, whether the US is in or out of that system?
Well, as you say, the idea of border tax adjustments have been around for a long time, actually for decades, back into the 1990s on carbon. It's going to be extremely politically controversial to impose. When the EU tried to impose aviation tax extended to other countries, there was incredible pushback on the EU, and they ultimately abandoned that. So I think you're going to see something similar with border tax adjustments. I think it might be harder for the US to, I mean, of course, it'll fight back in a Trump administration politically. I think legally might be more difficult given the U.S. stance with the WTO at the moment. Whether border tax adjustment is consistent with WTO, very tricky question. There's tremendous literature about it written on that. A lot, I think, would depend on how it's implemented. The details as to how it was actually put into effect. Some would, I think, be more capable of resisting WTO challenge than others. From a policy perspective, I think it makes a lot of sense because it both helps prevent carbon leakage and levels the playing field and protects competitiveness. But actually trying to operationalize it, to make it actually done in a way that reflects the embedded carbon, reflects the climate policies from the exporting country, incredibly difficult, I think, to actually operationalize.
Dave, you mentioned the possibility of a border tax adjustment as a potential influence on a second Trump administration. Can you say a little bit more about that? Do you think that would serve to interject the climate policy topic onto the trade agenda itself, whether there is a change in policy in a Trump administration or personnel and policy or not? Is that an external event that could move the needle on the Trump administration's climate policy in a second term?
So the answer is yes, maybe, right? Again, depending on how staffing shapes up and how the conversation in Europe evolves. I will say this, I think that, for those of us who've kind of looked at the issue, we do have major concerns with the unilateral imposition of BCAs, right? Because simply because, it's not, it may look good on paper, but you're going to have other countries respond to it, right? And look, our competitors can get really innovative and creative in their own design of a policy. And then you end up with a strong possibility of having a balkanized hybrid system of different BCAs with different accounting standards. And then in my opinion, that certainly would undermine one of the main goals of the Paris Agreement when it comes to reporting, accounting, and standardizing all of that, right? And would certainly undermine any sort of real attempt to have an international price for carbon. So there certainly is concerns whether a unilateral action would be effective from a climate perspective and what it would do to the remaining trade regime that we have. But I do think we can get creative and think about a plurilateral approach, sectoral approach that works for our multinationals, right? I think that from a geopolitical, trade, and climate perspective, it's in the U.S. interest to, figure out how to make our multinationals even more competitive, as we move forward in what's bound to be a more heated sort of global economic competition with Chinese state-owned enterprises and others.
Okay, well, I think that's a good segue. Dan, did you have something there, Dan?
Oh, I don't know if we're out of time or not, but I just wanted to sort of echo Dave. I think politically, border tax adjustments are going to be very difficult. There's a real tension between trying to lead multilaterally and try to convince other countries and imposing border tax adjustments, which is going to be very divisive. I think a promising thing, which really has never gone anywhere, but always has seemed to me to be a sensible approach, is sectoral approaches where you try to define sectoral standards that then would be a level playing field across that sector, and then try to, whatever penalties would be against companies, industry that don't meet those standards, those sectorally defined standards. So that's, I think, a way of trying to have a level playing field, deal with carbon, but without, but it would require a lot of cooperation to develop those sectoral standards, which may be difficult.
Yeah, thank you. And we're at the top of the hour, but I'm going to ask indulgence of our ASIL team just to give us a couple more minutes to touch on one particular, I guess you could call it a sectoral initiative that a couple of you have mentioned before, and that's the Kigali Amendment on HFC emissions under the Montreal Protocol, one of these adjacent areas outside the boundaries of Paris. And that agreement was a hard fought and hard won agreement by U.S. negotiators in the Obama administration, pushed by the United States, primarily driven by interests of U.S. industry. And the United States under the current administration has not ratified the Kigali Amendment, which has otherwise entered into force. It's not a sectoral agreement in the sense that I think, Dave, you and Dan were referring to, but it is an agreement that we've heard serious concerns about U.S. industry, U.S. chemical manufacturers being having their markets and their opportunities significantly disrupted by having the United States outside of that framework. And so I wonder, just in part as perhaps a window into or a harbinger of things to come if there is a second Trump administration, Dave, if you would be, I know you were in the White House during a lot of those discussions about whether the U.S. should join the Kigali administration or Kigali Amendment, and without revealing anything that would be inappropriate, I'd be interested in your thoughts about why are we still out of Kigali? Broad support from U.S. industry, wide swaths of U.S. industry, something that's been identified as a competitive threat if we stay out, would seem to align from an economic standpoint with the Trump administration's interest in promoting U.S. manufacturing. What's the holdup? And will it's on Dan's short list if Biden wins, but is this something where we might see some change in the next Trump administration? And if not, why?
So maybe. By the way, I hate having that as my answer, but I've been doing that all, for the hour. But look, I mean, the question of Kigali went all the way up to the deputies level. And for those out there who don't know what I'm talking about, you got a policy process. Starts out with people who are where I was at my level, right? You convene it. You work through the agencies, moves up to deputy secretary level. And if there's not an agreement there, it moves up to principals, and then it's brought to the president's desk. So Kigali went all the way up to deputies. There was a division amongst the agencies. Won't get into where everyone was, but I certainly would say that you had some ideologues that were opposed to doing anything related to climate. And didn't quite know how to message that piece. But then on the other hand, you had folks who got the manufacturing, the competitiveness, the trade agenda, and were supporting it because of that. So look, I mean, I think it's my opinion. I've argued this. I argued it back when I was in the NEC. Is that the president would be more likely to support Kigali than not if he were presented with the facts. How the deal helps U.S. manufacturing and places constraint on China. And I would also venture to say that some of those agencies and folks that opposed Kigali, moving it forward to principles, got that and knew it. And so therefore just put the brakes on it, and they haven't done anything with it. So yeah, so there is a possibility that, you could have someone come in, take it to deputies, to principals, and then have a real sort of conversation with the president. And again, I think that if it got to him, he'd be more likely than not to support it.
Dan or Allison, any comments from your perspectives about Kigali? And then I think, unfortunately, we are going to have to wrap up, but let's pause there and just give you both a chance to react. Allison.
So as Dave mentioned, industry and wide swaths of industry were in support of Kigali Amendment. Our industry is one of them that supported it, continues to support it. In a related topic, and I don't want to get us too far out, off track, we just earlier this week signed on to a letter to the Senate EPW commending them for a bipartisan approach to the American Energy Innovation Act, which would also phase down the use of HFCs. So ACC and our membership are supportive of that.
So we might see an end run around the White House through Congress, again pointing up the significance of an issue that we really haven't talked about except briefly, which is there's an election on Capitol Hill as well, and that branch of government has not gone away. Dan, anything from your perspective on Kigali other than what you already mentioned, which is that we should do it?
Yeah, nothing to add. I think just in a rational world, we would be joining Kigali. So hopefully we'll have a rational world.
That's a good note to end on, I think. That's a hopeful remark, and let's hope we do have a rational world going forward, regardless of what happens in the election. So we've reached the end of the time that we have available to us. I want to thank the panelists in particular for giving us your time. I want to thank ASIL for giving us the opportunity to have this discussion with each other and with the broader membership at large. And I want to encourage everybody watching to tune in to the next in the ASIL series on the consequences of the election. So with that, I will just say thank you to all of you.